So do you want to tell us some of the things, some of the ways of making money that people might not have thought of, or whether I'm wrong about sponsorship, in fact?
No, sponsorship is definitely there's 30 over 30 ways now to make money from a podcast. When I started, I probably knew about three. Within my third season, I was probably at about seven. Then I got to 11 ways. Then I sold a podcast channel and I was like, wow, I didn't know that was possible. Then I franchised a podcast channel. Then I was like, wow, it's another way. Then I licensed a podcast show. That was another way. Then I
How
sold
do
my
you, a
seat
minute,
to.
how do you franchise a podcast channel?
So classic example, I won't use my own because it feels narcissistic at this point, is to look at a show like The London Reel. The
Right.
London Reel is a variety show by Brian Rose, the shamed podcast host now, who ran for the mayor of London and was beaten by a trash can. But what he did was he licensed, he franchised the show to Canada. So there's Vancouver Reel. There's also Montreal Reel. And it's his exact formula, but with their own name. And he tells them how to monetize it, how to make money from it. And all his ads will be some of his ads, not all of his ads. Most of his ads will be about crypto, will be pushed towards helping that channel. If you've enjoyed this show talking to British people and American people, you're going to love the Canadian version, which is Montreal Real or Vancouver Real. So I did the same thing for Berlin. We just doubled the show. It's the exact show. We made a German version, ran it with a similar name structure, and that was a great way to make money out of it. Another way we took on a show, not another crypto show, the first time I ran it. By the first season, I had an advertiser, small adverts, 50 quid an episode, 10 episodes, 500 quid. And I was like, great. And what I'll do is an organic mention, right? And normally organic mentions, it's a great way to make money. You can do 10 quick fire questions at the end of the podcast. And if you listen to a podcast, you'll hear how this is used. So I go, I'm going to ask you 10 surefire questions at the end of the show, John. Number one question is, my favorite phone is iPhone. iPhone is incredible, don't you think? And I use this mouse cover. It's so strong. They've paid me 50 quid for that ad, but it doesn't sound like an ad because it's organic as part of the question. And I pass it on to you. You go, oh, I also have a phone. It's not my 10 essentials, but it's a great phone. And you mentioned the phone. The next thing I say is, John, I noticed your phone in the camera and it didn't have a mouse case. And you go, no, I don't need a case. I'm not 16-year-old and dropping my phone out the pub when I'm drunk. And I go, after this, I'm going to do a quick email introduction. Email introductions are 100 quid you can charge for a company to sponsor you to do email introductions to people who they have as influencers or people that buy en masse, or so basically it's an affiliate sale, right? Which is another way to monetize a podcast. Then, so I had that with Not Another Crypto Show. I had my first advertiser that was organic. Then they wanted a proper ad. Proper ad on average is about 250 quid if you have less than 10,000 listeners. Still good. 10 episodes, 2.5 grand. Now you're in. Now you're starting to see some traction. Maybe people are mentioning me when it comes to how did you find out about our site. We can throw in live podcasts. People come, I introduce you. So there's a real double win. And then I said to them, why don't you be the headline sponsor? I can talk about you all the time. I can get you as a guest on the show, but also you can get whoever you want as a guest on the show. And I can do introductions. You can't get them on a call for 30 minutes, but I can get them on a podcast. You've always wanted to meet John Spencer Williams. I'm going to get you on a podcast with him and you guys can make that introduction. Oh, that's worth being a sponsor. Great. Sponsoring starts at 2.5 grand. Okay. Now, would you like to buy my show because you know how it works? You've got the business model. Oh, and I've got 50,000 people that now listen to my show. So we did that with Pink, which is a fintech product with not another crypto podcast. And they bought it and they used the audience to go to their Seeders page and they raised $2.1 million for their company.
Wow.
So that's another way to monetize your podcast. Exactly right. You could do like I did. In my second season of the Guestless podcast, I wrote a book called The Entrepreneur. And it was like people that would listen to my show were in events or entrepreneurs. So I wrote a book about how to start a business if you want to get into events. 55,000 copies, 9 quid a book. Did it directly because I had an audience. Then I did a men's underwear range called Spanx. Then I did a merchandise line. Then I did a mug that came out. Like I totally monetized my audience base. Then I did affiliate sales. I got other people to come on and give me a link, and I got 25% of any single sale that came from the show notes or came from the website. So as you can see, what I'm doing is compounding. I call it a monetization waterfall. I start with one, then I add a second, then I add a third, then I add a fourth, then I add a fifth, and I just keep adding the streams. So if you think of it all at once, it's kind of like wanting water and someone pulls out a hose pipe from the fireman and just shoots you with water. And you're like, that's not what I needed. I just needed a couple of drips to get my mouth wet. So I normally start with when we work with clients, we go step one, find your audience. Like Harley Davidson said, people already were interested in bikes. They just didn't know about Harley Davidson. Number two, we need those audience to love you. We need them to follow you. We need them to go where you say go, to join the newsletter, to come buy your book, but not to sell them a book yet. Just get them to do small actions, right? Get them on the newsletter. That's really the biggest thing we can do, because then we get that indoctrination process. On season 3, we monetize that audience base. And we look at other ways to monetize that audience base and also your personal brand. And another way for someone like you, outside of books, which is obvious, is speaking engagements. You get to email the right now the Web Summit, biggest tech summit in the world, and go, I'd love to speak. This is a link to my podcast. You can hear me speak. You can hear me talk through a subject. You can hear me interview people. I'd love to be a panel moderator. This is a podcast episode where I'm moderating 6 people on a podcast. By the way, I charge minimum $2,500 plus flights plus expenses. I do a lot of that. So that's another great way to monetize. Another way is what I call Trojan horse philosophy, which is I wanted a meeting with a certain company because I thought if I can get a meeting with that company, there's a chance I could sell them this thing that I was working on, which is med tech. I had these machines and got a call in, got him on the podcast, spoke for 30 minutes, then dropped an email afterwards, started a relationship. Within 3 weeks, sold him a £25,000 machine. Well, that's paid for the podcast. We've done that with a client who sold a building and said at $1 million. Got him on the podcast, episode 1, season 1, just kept working on that relationship. By season 3, sold the building. And
What
the
was
whole
the-
show.
what was that podcast about then?
It's still on. It's called the Work Bold Podcast. It's on season 8. It now does it's got 70,000 downloads. He tweeted it, I think, today. But does between 6 and 7 figures for the runner of the podcast. So he's got lots of monetization. If you listen to the show, you'll hear headline sponsor, advertiser. You'll hear him organic mentions. They'll talk about paid promotions. They'll talk about events that he speaks at. You'll hear all the things that I talk about.